Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you're tuning in from, and welcome back to the third session of Mishnah in-depth Hullin with Rabbi Avie Walfish. This class is part of the Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah Division, sponsored in her memory by her family. This class is following the standard daily Mishnah study schedule, where you will be learning 1 to 2 mishnayot each day independently, following the standard schedule, and coming together once a week for a shiur to review, to go deeper into certain elements of the text in the context of a community of learners. It's always been a pleasure to learn with Rabbi Walfish for these past few weeks, and we're glad to have him back. Sources for today's class I'm going to post in chat momentarily. And you're welcome to follow along either with these sources shared on screen or following these along on your own device or printout. And with that, I'm going to hand over the mic to Rabbi Walfish.
Hey, thank you, Kayla. Okay, I wanted to just finish up one point that I didn't get to last week when we were learning Hullin chapter 3. Hullin chapter 3, the main topic is about the list of trefot, okay, and there are various physical issues an animal might have that would render it what we today call treif. Treif has been expanded to include anything non-kosher, but the technical meaning, we saw the biblical source for this and how the rabbis understood it, is that you're talking about some kind of injury, okay, or some kind of condition where the vital organs, okay, have a puncture or some other kind of wound, okay, that would cause the animal to die, according to the Talmud, within 12 months. And sages already in the Middle Ages were a bit puzzled by discrepancies between what we find in the Mishnah and the Talmud. The Talmud talks about a list of 18 different kinds of trefa, and what they knew from their current medical science. And today, of course, we have firmer knowledge, and there are certain details of the laws of trefot that don't seem to correspond to medical knowledge. And I just wanted to make a couple of brief points about that. Rambam, as might be expected, already noted that in his laws of shchita, and he says, "Ein losif al trefot elu klal." We cannot add to this list. In other words, even if an animal has some kind of terminal condition, that will not render the animal halachically a trefa. Okay, and in the second paragraph here at the top of the screen, he says, and those that the sages did enumerate as trefot, even if current medical knowledge is that some of them are not terminal, we have to follow what the sages determined. That is halachically binding upon us, even if it contradicts our current medical knowledge. A well-known responsum from the Middle Ages, the Rashba, Barcelona in 13th century, probably the leading halachic figure of his time, has a lengthy responsum where he discusses this, and he says what the sages say is true, and if medical science contradicts it, we follow the rabbis. We believe their tradition as opposed to the rabbis. And I just brought one other source. There's rich literature on this topic, as you might imagine, but one of the contemporary, leading contemporary poskim, Rav Moshe Feinstein, in his responsa, basically says current science does not determine the halacha. The science of the days of the rabbis is what determines the halacha in this matter, And even if current science contradicts it, we stay with the science of their time. There are a lot of variations on this theme, and there's also quite a bit of discussion as to how representative this might be of other areas where you might find a clash between the science underlying the halacha and science as we currently have it. Many authorities think that trefot is a specific area where we have ancient traditions that we follow, whether they make sense or not, according to contemporary science, and that would not necessarily be representative of other issues of science versus halacha. So obviously we did not in any way exhaust this issue. It's a very large issue, but I didn't want to just pass by the laws of trefot without noting how that has played a central role in these discussions of science versus halacha. And now we'll move on to chapter 4. Okay, I have here the text of chapter 4 up on the screen. We have the first few mishnayot. There's color coding that we'll get to as we go along, okay, to highlight some of the internal echoes and parallels. But first, let's just start off by noting what is the topic of chapter 4. Again, I'm starting with the assumption that people who are joining the shiur have read through these mishnayot as part of the Mishnah Yomit program. So I'm not going to stop and explain every detail. I'll try to explain enough so that even someone who hasn't read through it or who has forgotten a good part of it will be able to follow. So what is the main topic of chapter 4? So if you look at Mishnah 1, where we're talking about a chapter that has 7 Mishnah units, 7 mishnayot. The first one, Be'ema shehi mekasha le'leid. The fourth one, again, Be'ema shehi mekasha le'leid. We're talking about a difficult birth, okay, an animal that's having difficulty giving birth, okay, and then what happens, okay, in these 2 mishnayot and in several of the other mishnayot as well, what happens if while the birth is taking place, the animal, the fetus, sticks a limb out. One of the limbs of the fetus emerges, okay, and either just before or just after that event, okay, the mother is slaughtered, okay? So the mother is slaughtered for meat. And now the question is, what is the status of this limb of the fetus? And how does it impact on other issues relating to the mother, to the fetus, okay? And then other mishnayot in the chapter, starting with Mishnah Hey, okay, we have a new opening that opens 2 of the 3 mishnayot of the second part of the chapter. Hashochetet habema umatzaba. Okay, you slaughter an animal and discover within it, okay, a fetus. Okay, so what is the status of the fetus? Okay, so the first part of the chapter is about where a limb has emerged from the fetus, okay, in the course of birth, okay, and the shechita takes place sometime around that point. The second part talks about where you slaughtered the mother and just find the fetus inside. Okay, so we'll get into some of the nitty-gritty of these issues a bit further on. But first, I want, as part of our overview of the chapter, to wonder, together with you, why this chapter appears here at this juncture in Masechet Hullin. Okay, so this is an opportunity to review. The first two chapters dealt with the laws of shchita. What is a valid shchita? What is an invalid shchita? The third chapter, which we already alluded to, deals with the laws of trefot. Now, what is the law of a trefa? Law of a trefa is twofold, okay? And the laws of trefot appear within the framework of slaughtering. One of the reasons for that is that a trefa, even if slaughtered properly, is not kosher. Normally, an animal that, if you're talking about a basically kosher animal, one of the species of animal that's kosher, okay, a cow, a sheep, a goat, okay, or various animals that live in the wild, a deer, for example, buffalo, various kinds of animals that are um, that are kosher. But if it was not slaughtered, then it's what the Torah calls a nevela. Okay, it's the carcass of an animal that has not been properly slaughtered, and therefore the animal is a nevela. Now, the nevela has two halachot. One halacha is that it's forbidden to be eaten. The second halacha is that it defiles. Same way as a human corpse defiles, the carcass of an animal, and here we're talking about large animals, basically primarily mammals, okay, what would come under this heading. All the animals I mentioned earlier are mammals. Okay, all the kosher animals for sure are mammals. Obviously, many of the mammals are also not kosher. We're going to focus on on that on that type of animal. So a kosher animal not properly slaughtered is both not kosher, okay, forbidden to be eaten, and also a source of tuma. Okay, there are other animals, not all of which are mammals, smaller animals like rodents or certain types of smaller reptiles, okay, that also are sources of impurity. None of them is kosher. They're also sources of impurity, but a less severe type of impurity than the impurity that would be associated with the carcass of a cow, a sheep, a horse, a donkey, a lion, okay, a bear, okay, any of those would be a more serious, less serious than corpse impurity, but more serious than other types of impurities of dead animals. Okay, that's as far as a nevela is concerned. Now getting back to trefa. The animal that is basically a kosher animal, but is a trefa, so if slaughtered, it is not permitted to be eaten. Torah tells you not to eat it. Torah tells you to throw it to the dogs. Okay, we talked about that last week. But the Torah also indicates that it is not impure. It is not a nevela. The shchita, okay, has removed its tuma status. Now there was a Mishnah in chapter 3 that discussed that, okay, and some of its ramifications. We're not going to look at that. We will be looking at a Mishnah in chapter 4 that addresses this very issue and has something interesting to say about it. Okay, but trefa is not the subject of our chapter. Why it comes up in our chapter is part of what I'm putting on the table for now, which is why after the laws of shchita in chapters 1 and 2, the laws of trefa in chapter 3, why is the Mishnah now turning to the laws of a mother that is, in the first part of the chapter, in the process of giving birth, and something happens with the fetus around the time that the mother is being slaughtered. And then part 2 of the chapter is where the mother is slaughtered and then a fetus is found inside it. It turns out the animal is pregnant and there is a fetus inside the animal. Why would that be the next topic to be discussed? Okay, and while we're on the topic, let's take a brief look at chapter 5. Okay, in chapter 5, here's the text of chapter 5. Chapter 5 opens with the words Otov et Beno. Okay, Otov et Beno is a reference to a pasuk. Here it is in Parshat Emor. Okay, the pasuk highlighted in red. V'shor oseh otov et beno lo tishchatu biyom echad. Okay, an ox or a sheep, it and its offspring should not be slaughtered in one day. Okay, should not slaughter the animal and its offspring on the same day. Okay, so we're still talking about offshoots of the laws of slaughtering, right? Chapters 3, 4, and 5 are all offshoots of the laws of slaughtering. As we'll see next week, chapter 6 is also an offshoot of the laws of slaughtering, and arguably the chapters afterwards are also. But clearly, these are not the laws of slaughtering per se. These are certain ramifications, okay, of what happens when you slaughter an animal. So, okay, so the first thing I want to get a sense of is, what is there any rhyme or reason to this order? Is it just a potpourri of assorted items related to slaughtering animals for food? Okay, for non-consecrated food, Hullin means non-consecrated food, or is there some kind of rhyme or reason to this order? So let's start with chapter 4. Okay, so chapter 4, is there a reason why this would follow the laws of Treifa? Okay, so let's look a little more closely at some of the laws in chapter 4, and then I think we'll get some kind of insight into why chapter 4 is a logical follow-up to chapter 3. And then we'll also see how it's a logical bridge to chapter 5. Okay, so let's start with the first part. Okay, so let's look at Mishnah Aleph. Okay, Beimar shehi mekasha leleit. Okay, an animal that is having difficulty giving birth. Hotzi ha. Okay, now it's interesting. I have the Kaufman manuscript text up here. What we usually read, following other versions of rabbinic Hebrew that usually find in the printed versions and elsewhere, is ubar. That's a contemporary Hebrew word as well for a fetus. Okay, here, interestingly, the vowel pointing is over. Okay, and that's consistent. Okay, we'll call it ubar because that's a more familiar word to Hebrew speakers. Hotzi ha'ubar et yado ve'chzira. So the animal's foreleg, okay, it's called yad. A yad for an animal means a foreleg. Okay, its foreleg emerges, ve'chzira, and then returns. Okay, I don't know if such a thing exists. I think I once asked my daughter, who's an OBGYN, and I think I once asked her if such a thing can actually happen. I mean, it's described in the Torah, right? Yehudah's two twin sons from Tamar. Okay, so Zerach stuck his hand out and it emerged and then went back into the womb, and then Peretz came out instead. Okay, so the Torah knows of such a reality. I believe contemporary medical science does not, but okay, we'll take it at face value that there is such a case. Okay, so the fetus's foreleg emerges and then returns to the womb. Okay, then mutar. Okay, mutar presumably means that if the mother is then slaughtered, so as we see in the second half of the chapter, okay, השוחט את הבהמה ומצא בין 8 חי או מת או בין 9 מת, קוראו מוציא את דמו. Okay, that the fetus is permitted to be eaten. Not only is the fetus permitted to be eaten, but this Mishnah says you don't have to slaughter it. Okay, and even if it's an 8-month-old, okay, the pregnancy of a cow is 9-month pregnancy. So if it is a 9-month, okay, according to Rabbi Meir in the continuation of Mishnah A, okay, I'm looking at the third line here. Matzava ben tisha chai, if it's a 9-month-old live fetus, then it requires shchita, according to Rabbi Meir, and the Chachamim say, shchitat imo metaharatu. Okay, the shchita of the mother permits it. Okay, in other words, a fetus, even if it's 9 months, it's viable. It could have been born. It just happens not to have been. It's alive. Okay, if you had waited to slaughter the animal another 3 hours, the fetus would be out already. Doesn't matter. The fetus is a part of the body of the mother. The slaughtering of the mother permits the fetus. Okay, now that's disputed by Rabbi Meir. Says since it's already a viable fetus that could have been born, so it's already a separate entity, and the slaughtering of the mother does not permit it. Okay, but everyone agrees if it's an 8-month fetus, since it's not viable, it could not have been born, it is certainly a part of the body of the mother, and is included in the slaughtering of the mother. This, by the way, in the Talmud is called ben pakuah, okay, and it creates an interesting discussion that poskim have talked about, and that is that a ben pakuah, okay, according to a part of the Mishnah they left out here, ben pakuah, even if you don't eat it right away, okay, you don't kill it right away and eat it. You let the animal grow, and the animal is already, in the language of the Mishnah, 4 or 5 years old, okay, and it's working in the field. You can eat it without shchita. You can eat it without ritually slaughtering it. You can't eat it while it's alive. Okay, that would be Ever Menachai, which is prohibited. But you can kill the animal in whichever way you like, because it has already been ritually slaughtered. And so the discussion has come up about, can you breed a herd of animals that will not need slaughtering? You take a father that's a ben pakuah, you take a mother that's a ben bat pakuah, okay? You make them, you breed them, their offspring continue to maintain the same status. You can have a whole herd of animals that don't require shchita. Okay, that's a discussion. Some authorities think that the model breaks down. Okay, you can't have a whole herd of them, but in any from Talmudic sources, it would look like that might be a possibility. In any event, that emerges from this Mishnah. Go back to the first part of the chapter, Mishnah Aleph. So when it says here mutar, that presumably means that the fetus itself, including the foreleg, is mutar. The mother has been slaughtered. The fetus is part of the body of the mother. And the foreleg, even though at one point it emerged into daylight, since by the time of the slaughtering it returned to the womb, so it's included in the slaughtering of the mother, and it's mutar. Hotzi et rosho, if the head emerges, afal pishach zero, areza kialud. That's true of humans as well, that halachically, the birth is considered to have taken place when the head crowns. Okay, when the baby's head crowns, emerges from the womb during the birth, that is considered to be a birth, and the baby is no longer a fetus. Okay, and for example, that has relevance to the laws of abortion. That comes up in a different place in the Mishnah, Masechet Oholot, chapter 7, that even if the mother's life is in danger, you can no longer abort the baby to save the mother, because the baby is now a living creature just like the mother. As long as the baby was a fetus, so the mother's life takes precedence. The minute the baby has been born, which is when the head has emerged, so the baby is already an independent human being, and we're not allowed to intervene. Neither the mother's life nor the baby's life takes precedence as far as we're concerned. They both have equal right to life, and we're not permitted to kill the baby in order to save the mother. Okay, so that's also based on the idea that the head is considered to be the birth. Okay, then the Mishnah continues with Chatach min ha'ubar b'meyeha. What if, what if, as the birth was taking place, the let's call him the shepherd, dismembers the fetus. He starts, chopping apart parts of the fetus inside the womb. The birth has not taken place yet. Okay, but now these are separate limbs inside the mother. Mutar ba'achila. Then you're permitted to eat those limbs as well. In other words, the fetus, the main body of the fetus, is part of the body of the mother. And even though the limbs have been severed, as long as they're inside the womb, they're still considered to be part of the body of the mother. So the mother's slaughtering permits them as well. However, let's say while you're slaughtering the mother, what you do is you perform an operation and you sever the spleen, or you sever the kidneys. Then asur b'achila. Then those internal organs are not permitted. They did not have a shchita. Only organs that are still an organic part of the body of the animal participate in the shchita and are permissible to be eaten. But if, while the shchita is taking place, these organs have been detached, have been severed, even though they're inside the body of the animal, they are not considered to be part of the body of the animal. Okay, now here, and here the Mishnah explains why. Zaklal. Davar shu gufo asur. Davar she'eno gufo mutar. Sounds a little paradoxical, but this is the formulation of the Mishnah. Okay, something that is an organic part of the mother's body If it's been severed from the mother's body, then the shchita doesn't permit that part of the body. Okay, and so you'll be allowed to eat the let's say the cow. You will not be allowed to eat the spleen, okay, or the kidney. However, something that is not an organic part of the mother's body, such as a fetus, the fetus is an independent creature. And here's the paradox. This independent creature is part of the mother's body so long as it hasn't been born, even if its connection to the body has been severed. So the fetus hasn't been born yet. The fetus is part of the mother's body. The limbs of the fetus have been severed, but they are still inside the womb. They are still considered to be part of the body of the mother as far as the laws of shchita are concerned. Okay, that's this somewhat paradoxical principle with which the chapter opens. And now I'd like to come back to my question: why is this a natural follow-up to chapter 3? So one hint as to why comes from the words tchol and klayot. Chapter 3 mentioned both the tchol, the spleen, and the klayot, the kidneys, because the Mishnah, in describing which internal organs would render an animal a treifa, let's say the animal is missing one of the organs, or one of the organs has a puncture, or some other physical problem. So these two organs were mentioned as organs that do not render the animal a treifa. Okay, the heart, the lungs, different parts of the stomachs. Okay, I'm saying stomachs in the plural because kosher animals have multiple stomachs. They chew their cud, which means they have multiple stomachs. Okay, so certain problems in one or another of those stomachs, those would render the animal a treifa. The spleen and the kidneys do not. So here we have a link to the previous chapter, and the link goes beyond an associative link. Because what effectively is the Mishnah doing? The Mishnah saying the previous chapter focused very heavily on the organs of the animal, okay, and how the different organs of the animal impact on the animal's viability, and therefore impact also on the results of shchita. How will shchita affect the animal? And here, the Mishnah is focusing on something that isn't a limb, but is very much like a limb, namely the fetus. This, by the way, is also a word play in the Mishnah, because the word for fetus is ubar, over, or ubar. The word for organ, which appears in Mishnah Bet, v'vakerechi mekashal leid v'chatech aver. Aver and ubar, okay, are two very similar sounding words. Okay, they have similar letters. You have difference between, the only difference is an aleph versus an ayin in terms of the spelling. Other than that, it's bet resh in both of them. Okay, so what our chapter is doing right at the beginning is comparing the ubar to an aver. And the first Mishnah says, well, the ubar is different from an aver. During the shchita process, if avarim, limbs or organs, are severed, then they don't participate in the shchita. But the ubar, whose limbs are severed, will participate in the shchita. Okay, so from parts of the animal's body, we're moving on to a kind of intermediate stage of another animal that is currently part of the animal's body, namely the fetus. It is a limb, but it's also an independent being. And that's exactly what chapter 4 is going to talk about. Okay, so now once we've noted that, we can also note that as we go through the chapter, there are other allusions to the laws of Trefot, including not just an allusion, but a direct and explicit reference to the laws of Shchita. Let's go back to Mishnah Dalid. Okay, where again, very similar to Mishnah Aleph, Beimashi Mikasha Leleid, Hotzi Ha'ubar et Yado, once again, the foreleg emerges, V'chatacha. Here's the difference. Okay, the leg was then cut off. The foreleg that emerged was cut off. V'achar kach shachat et imo habasar tahor. Okay, so what happens here is the animal is still alive. You haven't slaughtered it yet, and you sever this foreleg that has emerged. Now, when you sever the foreleg, it becomes tamei, very similar to tumat nevela. Okay, same way that the carcass of the animal is a tuma source, the limb that has been severed from a live animal becomes a tuma source. Okay, but it doesn't defile the animal because the animal is still alive. And a live animal does not contract tuma. When is an animal susceptible to contracting tuma? If the animal has been ritually slaughtered so that it doesn't have tumat nevela. Okay, the slaughtering of the animal purifies it. It not only permits it to be eaten, it also purifies it from carcass impurity, tumat nevela. Okay, but at the same time, it's now a potential food item, and potential food items can contract tuma by coming into contact with tuma. So that's why the Mishnah continues and says, "Shachat imo v'achar kach chatacha." If you slaughter the mother and then sever, okay, and then sever the foreleg, so the foreleg is sticking out. Okay, you slaughter the animal, okay, and then you sever the limb, okay, then the limb is tamei, and since the limb that became tamei was touching the animal, it was touching the fetus and touching the slaughtered animal, they now contract the impurity that a food item can contract when it comes into contact with a tuma source. That's called habasar maga nevela. The Chachamim say no, it doesn't. We'll talk about why in just a minute. Okay, but okay. So Rabbi Meir says it does get this tuma. The Chachamim say no, it's maga trefa shchuta. It isn't a nevela, it's a trefa. Okay, why? Because this limb was still attached to the animal at the time of shchita. So even though the shchita didn't permit the limb to be eaten, the shchita did purify it. Okay, and the Chachamim bring an interesting proof. They say, this is what's highlighted in the yellow, Ma matzinu b'trefa sheshchitata metaharta, av shchitat beima tetaheret ha'ubar. The same way that a trefa, okay, the trefa is an animal with a punctured lung, a punctured heart, a punctured brain, whatever, and its shchita doesn't permit it to be eaten, but does purify it from tumah, so too, the shchita of the mother permits the fetus. It purifies the fetus. It prevents the fetus from contracting any kind of tumah. Okay? Since the limb was still attached at the time of shchita, so the limb doesn't become tameh, and it doesn't then pass on the tumah to the slaughtered animal. Okay, and then there's a whole big debate, and the Chachamim refer back to the differentiation we had in the first Mishnah between a part of the animal's body and a foreign body inside the animal, and says, and they say, that's why your analogy is faulty. You can't compare the treifa, okay, where you can't compare the treifa, whose body is purified. The organic parts of its body are purified by its shchita. You cannot compare that to to the fetus, which is not an organic part of the body, that is not purified by the shchita. Okay, so now there's a back and forth on that in the Mishnah, but now why am I dwelling on this? Because here the Mishnah explicitly brings Rabbi Meir's brings the Chachamim's argument that try to prove the law of this limb and the fetus from the laws of treifa. So here we see a very clear tie-in between this chapter and the previous chapter. Having said that, there's another literary tie-in between the laws of treifa and the laws of this chapter, and that is twice the chapter refers to limbs of an animal, okay, that are thrown to the dogs, okay, both in Mishnah Bet and in Mishnah Zayin. Okay, we have limbs that are thrown to the dogs. Now, why is that relevant to our discussion? What else is thrown to the dogs in our sources? An animal that's a treifa. Vasar basadeh treifa lo tochelun lakelev tashlichun oto. We talked about this some length last week. Now, why the Torah specifically talks about throwing to the dogs when we're talking about a treifa? So even though these cases, neither one of them is a treifa, both cases actually of a bechor, a potential bechor, but the fact that the Mishnah talks about throwing to the dogs also evokes the association of a treifa. Mishnah Vav actually talks about the laws of treifa, but I want to move on to some other points, so we won't go into that. But if you take a closer look at Mishnah Vav in chapter 4, you'll see that it opens with the laws of treifa and continues with laws that are related to the subjects of chapter 4. But the first part of Mishnah 6 is actually something that should belong in chapter 3, except that it's similar to the continuation, which is part of chapter 4. And now one final halachic connection, and that is that when the Talmud asks, why is it, in fact, that when the foreleg is outside the womb, why doesn't slaughtering the mother permit that foreleg to be eaten? After all, it's still part of the fetus. The fetus is part of the body of the mother as far as slaughtering is concerned. The foreleg is still attached to the fetus. Why does the slaughtering not permit it? And the Talmud answers from a drasha on the pasuk, my tama, what's the reason? Damar krav asar basadeh trefa lo tochelu, kevan sheyatza basar chutz limchitzato ne'esar. Basar basadeh trefa, and the Midrash wonders, why do we describe the trefa as being found out in the opening, out in the wild, in the open field? Why does the Torah stress that? And the Midrash's answer is to represent that any meat that is found outside of its normal environment, okay, animals belong, we're talking primarily about domestic animals, they belong in a domestic setting. They're out in the open field, okay, they're out of their setting. So the foreleg of the animal is out of its setting. Its proper place is inside the mother with the rest of the body of the fetus. If it's outside, then it's outside of its setting. Insofar as it's outside of its setting, it is like a trefa. It has the same laws as trefa. And so the Mishnah is actually combining the laws discussed in this chapter with the laws of trefa. It's deriving many of the laws in chapter 4 from the laws of trefa, seeing it as a kind of extension of the laws of trefa. So for all those reasons, chapter 4 really very much belongs at this juncture as a kind of appendix to the laws of trefa. And now, why does chapter 5 follow chapter 4? So once again, we have a clue, a hint in the language of the chapter. Look at Mishnah 5. Just a second. In Mishnah 5, the Mishnah talks about where you find a fetus inside the slaughtered animal, and then Rabbi Meir argues, okay, in the indented line here, Matzaba ben Tisha Chai, if you find a fetus that's 9 months old and alive and viable, then ta'un shchita, requires shchita, v'chayav mishum otovet beno. And just as it requires its own slaughtering, you can't slaughter it on the same day as the mother, because that would violate the principle of otovet beno, which is the subject of chapter 5. So the same way that chapter 4 alludes back to chapter 3, it also alludes forward to chapter 5. But I think there's a deeper connection, once again, between chapter 4 and chapter 5. Chapter 4 is about a mother giving birth, finding a fetus inside, or the fetus hasn't fully emerged. A piece of the fetus emerges. Piece of the fetus is cut off. So Mishnah 4 focuses on the birth process, what happens during the birth process, and what happens if there's a fetus that never got to be born. And what does chapter 5 talk about? Otovet beno, the fetus that did get to be born. After the fetus is born, as we saw in chapter 4, Mishnah 5, after the fetus is born, it requires shchita, and it cannot be slaughtered on the same day as the mother. Okay? Now, chapter 5, as we'll see in a few minutes, introduces us into a whole lengthy section that will take us to the very end of Tractate Hullin. Chapter 5 is the first of a series of 6 chapters that all open with the same opening. We'll look at that shortly. Okay, but first, let's get a bit of background on this law of Otov et Beno. Why are we not allowed to slaughter a parent and its offspring on the same day? There's a dispute in Halacha whether Otov et Beno should really be Otav et Bena, mother and offspring. Okay? Something we know from the previous chapter that it certainly applies, even though Otov et Beno is all in the masculine, it certainly applies to the mother. Some say it applies only to the mother and not to the father, and some say no, it applies both to the mother and to the father. Okay, but be that as it may, what's the rationale? Why not? Okay, so let's look first of all at the passage in the Torah. V'shor oseh otov et beno lo tishchatu b'yom echad. And it's worth noting in what context it appears. Okay, the pasuk immediately beforehand talks about the laws of sacrifices. Shor o chesev o eiz ki yivaled vayashivat yamim tachat imo umiyom hashmini v'hala yeratzel lekorban isheh l'Hashem. Okay, it must be with the mother for 7 days before it's acceptable as a sacrifice to God. Okay, you think of another similar halacha. Okay, 7 days with the mother, and on the 8th day, it's in a way given to God.
Bris.
Brit Milah, right? Brit Milah is very similar. Okay, 7 days, the baby is with the mother. The 8th day, the father takes charge. Okay, and circumcises what makes the baby a male. Okay, a potential father in his own right. Okay, so he enters the world of fatherhood, as it were, on the 8th day, and of course becomes consecrated to God through the Brit Milah, which is our covenant with God. Okay, so I think it's a very powerful parallel between them. Okay, but also, is there something in common between these laws? Let's first of all note that pasuk immediately afterwards returns us to the laws of sacrifices. Sandwiched in between laws of sacrifices is this law that applies to Hullin of Otov et Beno. And now, is there something in common between leaving the animal with its mother for 7 days before it can be acceptable as a sacrifice, and for Hullin as well, don't slaughter it on the same day as the mother? Okay, so many commentators, I just brought one example, both because it's in English and because it's, I think it presents things in a, very beautiful and insightful fashion, but it's building on ideas that go back many hundreds of years earlier. Rav Hirsch says all these laws could be connected with the one idea of the animal-mother relation to the animal young. It is in this phase of animal life that the beginning of an approach to human character shows itself. Egotism, love of oneself, looking after oneself, is the powerful spring that moves animal life. Sacrificing oneself for the existence of another creature and devoted care for its well-being, as occurs in the birth and care for the young, is the first elevation to that forgetfulness of self which forms the most divine trait in the nobility of human character. This human-like spark is not to be allowed to be extinguished. This trace of humanity renders the animal fit for representing as an offering the ideal of morality to which man is to aspire. As this same consideration for the humane factors in animal life is demanded in the Oto Vet Beno law for Hullin, for the provision of meat for ordinary human consumption, the stamp of altar-like purpose of morality is impressed on the everyday Jewish table. Okay, so I think Hirsch's words speak for themselves, but there's one very crucial point that I'd like to point out, and that is Hirsch also notes the connection between Oto Vet Beno, which applies both to Korbanot and to Chulin, okay, and the laws of Korbanot that surround them. There's both the law of Shivat Yamim Tachat Imo and the law of Oto Vet Beno represent respect for this human-like quality of caring, of mothers caring for their young. Of course, there's another well-known mitzvah that is generally understood in the same way, and that is
Shiloach haken.
Shiluach HaKen, and yet another one that is often understood in the same way, and that's Basar B'Chalav. And both of those commandments will appear later on in our tractate. Okay, and so that, okay, what Hirsch is picking up on is a kind of leitmotif in tractate Hullin. But what's also a leitmotif is the connection between sacred foods and secular foods. Okay? We saw last week the trefot, okay, we saw this in Hirsch's disciple, Radatz Hoffman, okay, who noted that the laws of trefa are in a way like the laws of blemishes, and they also transfer the laws of sacred foods into the everyday Jewish table. And that's what Tractate Hullin is very much about. Tractate Hullin, smack in the middle of Seder Kodshim. Seder Kodshim is all about sacrifices. Hullin is mostly about secular food. But the laws of Shchita represent taking part of the sacrificial service and transplanting it into the realm of preparing meat for the table. The laws of Trefot, and now the laws of Oto Vet Beno are doing the same thing. When it comes to the laws of Oto Vet Beno, the Mishnah doesn't leave this to guesswork. The Mishnah says it explicitly. And this is how the chapter opens. Oto Vet Beno noheg ba'aretz u'b'chutz ha'aretz b'fnei habayit v'shelo b'fnei habayit b'chulin u'v'muktashim. Okay? B'chulin u'v'muktashim. So we start off by saying it applies everywhere and at all times. Okay? In Eretz Israel or outside, when there is a temple, when there is no temple. And, most crucially, b'chulin u'v'muktashim. It applies both to chulin and to sanctified foods. And the first couple of mishnayot work through various permutations of what if there are two animals, okay, of let's say a mother and offspring, and I slaughter the two of them on the same day. What if both of them are chulin? What if both of them are sacrificial animals? What if one is chulin and the other is sacrificial? The first one is chulin, the second one is sacrificial. The first one is sacrificial, the second one is chulin. Add in some other factors. What if both of them are slaughtered outside of the temple? What if both of them are slaughtered inside the temple? What if one is in and one is out, and that can go in either direction? Working through all of these permutations and what the results will be. And what the Mishnah is really doing is weaving together the laws of Kodshim and the laws of Chulin. Oto Vet Beno is the meeting point of these two areas of the law, okay, of Kodshim and of Chulin. So that, on the one hand, is a main Chulin topic, okay, and on the other hand, as Rav Hirsch pointed out in what we looked at today, as Radatz Hoffman pointed out in the passage we read last week, okay, we see why, certain laws, not all sacrificial laws are applicable to Chulin, but many of those that are, okay, are those that express a deeper sense of Jewish values, not just the value of connecting to God, but other values, such as the value of humaneness, okay? We respect the motherly instinct, okay, and therefore we give, okay, we give recognition to it even as we're taking the life of the animal, and that has to be pointed out, okay? It's not that, we love animals so much that we will not take their lives. We will take their lives for our food. That is something allowed. That's something that even we invest with certain aspect of sanctity. But part of what invests it with sanctity is the fact that even while we're doing that, we give, at least symbolically, we give recognition, okay, to this noble instinct that even animals possess, and that we admire, and that we want to emulate, and want to make part of ourselves. And so we have to make a nod to it, at least give recognition to it, even within the framework of slaughtering. And now, as I mentioned, this opens a whole series of chapters, which it's actually 6 chapters in Chulin, divided into 2 groups of 3. Chapter 5 is the first. We'll look at the next 2, Bezrat Hashem, next week, chapters 6 and 7, and they all open up with, from Otovet Beno in our chapter, we move to Kisui Hadam, covering the blood for certain kinds of slaughtering. From there we move in chapter 7 to Gid HaNasheh, the sciatic nerve, okay, which we're not allowed to consume, okay, and for all 3 of these halachic areas, the Mishnah opens the discussion with Noheg ba'aretz u'b'chutz la'aretz, b'fnei habayit v'shelo b'fnei habayit, b'chulin u'b'muktashim. Noheg ba'aretz u'b'chutz la'aretz, I'm in chapter 6. B'fnei habayit v'shelo b'fnei habayit, b'chulin avalo b'muktashim. It's a little different. Here we differentiate chulin and muktashim. We'll talk about why next week. Gid HaNasheh, like Otovet Beno, is b'chulin u'b'muktashim. Now, chapters 6 and 7 have a line absent from chapter 5. We don't have time to discuss that today, but that's fine because we will, Zrat Hashem, have ample time to discuss that next week. But what we see in all 3 chapters is the Mishnah starts off by saying, how does this aspect of the laws of Chulin, how does it compare to the laws of Kodshim? Laws of Kodshim, of course, apply only in Eretz Yisrael, only b'fnei habayit, only b'muktashim. These laws apply, all of them apply to Chulin, some apply to muktashim as well, and some do not. So these chapters, more than any other part of Tractate Chulin, really underscore how Chulin is interacting with the larger framework of Kodshim, and how we're framing how we eat meat, we're framing it by the laws of Kodshim, and saying, okay, we take certain aspects of Kodshim, other aspects, of course, we don't, okay? And that's what Tractate Chulin, as a general rule, is trying to do. We will close with that for this evening. Erev Tov and Shavua Tov to all.
Shavua Tov, thank you.
Thank you. I hope to see all of you next week. I hope you enjoyed today's class. Take care. keep following along with Mishnah Yomit. And we'll continue next Sunday. Goodbye.